There are several ways to access your models from a coldbox application. All the traditional CFML options we looked at in our last video will still work for you. Create object or new, which you're probably familiar with already from legacy CFML development. Remember, models are just CFCs. We call them models because of the type of code inside them. GetInstance also returns the same CFC component. You'll get all the methods you're expecting, whatever lives inside your component. But when you're using GetInstance, the CFC is decorated by Wirebox, so it sticks some additional functionality inside the component as it's created. Nothing that will break your SQL or business logic, just some extra things that make dependency injection and AOP a bit easier between the components whenever it is you need that in your application. Remember, this is all optional stuff that you can basically ignore if you're not yet comfortable using it, but we'll show you some of the basic things that are provided for you by Wirebox and coldbox in hopes of getting you more comfortable with them later in this video series. Here on the screen you can see we've got the list function inside our user's handler, and I'm calling getInstance on line 49, returning back an instance of our user's object, and then I'm just dumping it out to the screen. So you can see here what actually is inside that component. I've got the methods I expect to be here: get first name, get last name. These are the getters and setters from our property tags in our user CFC model. In fact, I'll show you that right now. Here's our property tags. And we've also got some methods in here that are doing basic CRUD stuff: get users, get user details, save users, and so on. They're not really named in a traditional CRUD sort of naming convention. These would probably be named things like save, create, insert, update, and so on in a better application. But for our demo purposes, you get the idea. This one gets all the users back. This one gets the user details back. This is our model user CFC with a few property tags inside it. And back here again is our handler: get an instance of users, save it to that variable, and then I just dump it out to the screen. That's what we see here. All of the getters and setter functions we expect, but then there are things like get property mixin, get variables mixin, include it in mixin, and so on. Those are the items being decorated on our object by Wirebox when we use getInstance to create an instance of our user's component. So that's basically what the getInstance method does: creates the object for you and wraps it in the Wirebox functionality that you may or may not end up using later on in your application. There used to also be a method called getModel that did similar things, but getModel has been deprecated and is completely removed from coldbox in version 6. So try to stay away from getModel so your code stays more compatible with the latest version of coldbox. If you see older code maybe in an older coldbox application at your company, if that code is still using getModel, try to block off some time and update it to use getInstance instead so that you don't run into any compatibility issues when coldbox 6 is released. Let's take a look at the messages handler for a bit here. We have list, detail, save, and delete handlers in the file, and they all use the getInstance method to retrieve a copy of the messages model for us. Currently, we have 5 different spots in this CFC that all do getInstance messages. Obviously this works, but we've got yet another way we can retrieve our CFCs with even less typing than this. At the top of our handler CFC, I've got a property tag for the name objmessages. That's nothing new. This is pretty standard property tag syntax. But take a look at the part on the right-hand side of that line of code where it says inject equals messages. Wirebox will let us inject items from our models folder straight into the handler just by using this property tag with the inject notation we see here. And now we can go through all of those handlers we have below and remove the getInstance calls, replacing them with just the variable objmessages, and we'll get the exact same object usable in our handlers without having to call the getInstance method 5 different times in our code. I'm going to scroll down here to our list method. This one's pretty small, it's easy to follow. getInstance messages read, and then it goes off to the list view. Here's our page. You can see that it works. I'm going to go back up here to the top and just copy that variable, come back down here to list, and I'll replace getInstance messages with our variable right there, save and reload, and you can see we get the exact same results. I'll click on one of our messages. That's the detail handler. Let's go down here to detail. You can see we're calling getInstance messages here as well. I can actually get rid of that line of code entirely since we're just calling it, saving it into a variable called objmessages. Save, and now this variable on line 58 is actually the instance of that object that was created by our property tag at the top of this handler. Save and reload, and you can see that runs the exact same way as it did before as well. So in this case, in the list method, we were able to get rid of a call to get instance and just use a variable, which speeds up our application a tiny bit. And down here in the details method, we were able to delete an entire line of code and just use that property tag instance that was created for us instead of creating a variable in our handler directly. So we cut down the size of a line of code here, and we got rid of a line of code entirely here, all just by using the property tag that we have up here at the top of our file. And you can see I have several other spots that use get instance messages. Here in our save method, we've got 2 of them. I could replace both of those with just that variable now as well. And then down here in our delete handler, I could get rid of the first half of this line of code and just use that variable in this situation as well. In the previous examples, we used Wirebox to inject a model from inside a handler, but you can also do this inside a model and inject models into other models themselves. Here I've got my messages CFC model, the same code that we saw previously. And down here in the read method, so remember I'm reading from the messages database table. So normally this code would output the contents of whatever's in the messages table. You can see here on line 49, I'm actually dumping an instance of the object for the users table and calling the getUsers method, and then just dumping the contents of the screen and aborting it. There's no getInstance call in here. There's no createObject or new call in this method. I'm simply using a property tag at the top of my model object to get the user's model injected into my messages model, just like we did here in the handler, where I injected the messages model into my messages handler. I can do that from a model into a handler, and I can do that from a model into another model, which is what we have here. It's the exact same syntax. Property tag name inject, property tag name inject. So down here on line 49, I'm going to save that, reload it, and you can see this is what we get as the output. We get the actual contents of our users table from inside the messages event handler. So you're not stuck with using just the messages model inside the messages handler. You're also not required to do something like be in the handler and have to call get instance 5 or 6 times in one of these methods here to get all the different instances of your database logic loaded up into variables so that you can link them together and build join queries or build whatever the user output is that you're trying to build in your application. You can actually do all of that stuff directly in your models by just injecting one model into another using the same property tag syntax that we saw previously in the handler. They both work the exact same way. Brief reminder, when you add a property tag to your handlers or to your model classes, make sure you reload coldbox so it picks up those changes. Otherwise, you may run into some bugs and slow down your development experience. The getInstance method is provided by the framework supertype CFC, and we've mentioned that a few times now. That framework supertype CFC is where a lot of the baked-in coldbox functionality comes from. Another method that is provided for us by that framework supertype is one called populate model, and we're going to look at an example of how that works now. Here's our user details form again. In this version, we're going to use the populate model function to get the same functionality for saving the user to the database, but with less code than we've used previously. Here's the save handler, and the commented out block of code at the top of the method is our original code for calling the save user method in our user model CFC. We had to get an instance of the user's model object, we had to call the save user method, and we had to pass it 5 different arguments. Not a terribly large amount of work, but our user detail form is pretty small. So imagine if there was a larger form we were dealing with from something like an insurance or a college admission application with dozens of fields. We'd have to pass dozens of arguments into that save user method. That'd get really tedious pretty fast, and we would probably be prone to having lots of typos and errors as a result. In this version of the code, I've commented out that chunk of code and we've replaced it with a call to populate model. As you can see here, we're passing populate model 2 things: an instance of the user CFC, just like before, and the memento argument is just set to the RC scope, which includes all of our form fields. And this does the exact same job with somewhat less typing than our original version does. See here, save user, does that one line of code, and then I save my user, bounces back to the user list. So let's go back here to our browser. I'll reload that page just so you can see that this is fresh data we're dealing with. I'll add a number 2 to the end of Ringo's name, save it, and you can see there's Ringo 2 star. It did actually take that update for us. Here's the code again. So you can see instead of this sort of super long one line of code or maybe 5 lines of code, depending on how you want to count it, we got this. Populate model, pass it the model, and pass it the memento, go from there. We can actually streamline that a bit more and use this version too. Populate model, pass it the model users and the memento. So in the first version, we were getting an instance of the user's component. It was actually creating that object, storing it in memory, and saving that as a variable being passed in as an argument to our populate model function. You don't actually have to go through the trouble of creating an instance of the user component if you're just going to call populate model. You can actually just pass it the name of the component that you want to create a model of, and Wirebox under the hood with populate model will go out and find that user CFC and create one for you, and then it will use this memento argument and take whatever variables are in there and stick them into the user's CFC as it creates the object for us out the other side. I'll save that and reload it, and you can see that this works the exact same way. Ringo still has the number 2 after his name. Save that, and there it's back to Ringo with no typo in it. We can get even more streamlined than that too, actually. I'm going to comment that version of it out and go with this third version. Here you can see we're still calling populate model, and I'm still passing it just the name of the CFC users. We're not actually creating an instance of it. But in this version, we don't even have the memento tacked on here at the end. It just says populate model, model equals users. I'm going to save that, reload our page. This time let's go into John Lennon, and let's change it to Let's change it to Joe Lennon. Save it, and you can see that runs how we expect it to as well. So the reason this works is the first part is the same as what we saw up here. Populate model will just look for a model using Wirebox called users, grab that CFC and create an instance of it for us in memory. If you don't pass a memento argument in with a structure in it, with all the variables in it we need to use to populate our model, by default, populate model will just look in the RC scope automatically. So if you're just passing the RC scope in as your memento, you can leave that argument off entirely, and populate model will just go look there for you by default. The trick to this is all of the properties in your, in this case, user CFC, have to have the exact same names as the fields on your form. So here in my form, we're going to go to the user detail form, users details, views, users details. You can see the fields in here are named first name, last name, email, password. Now let's take a look at our model. Models, users. Here's our users CFC. Look at the properties, first name, last name, email, password. The names have to match in both of those. The data coming into your RC scope, which is your form fields, and the data getting pushed into the database, which are the property tags here in your model. That's why this populate model syntax and this populate model syntax and this populate model syntax are all able to work. So as long as those two sets of names match up equally, populate model can cut down on a whole lot of typing you have to do to wire the different sections of your application together. And really, it's not that much to ask to make sure that your forms have the same naming convention as the property fields in your models, because all of coldbox is based off of naming conventions and just being consistent with how you name things. So really, if you're just consistent with how you name your forms and how you name your property tags, using populate model requires no extra work at all in your application. And all it does is it saves you actually typing. Rather than typing great big long lines of code like this, you can type one line of code like this and get the exact same functionality into your application. There's some additional documentation and examples of how to use these methods here in the coldbox.ortusbooks.com documentation. You can also integrate a third-party DI framework like DI1 or ColdSpring to use that to manage your CFCs if for some reason you want more or different functionality than what's baked into Wirebox or ColdBox. Honestly, unless I'm dealing with a really large legacy CFML application that already uses, say, ColdSpring in it a lot, I generally shy away from that kind of functionality. But if you want to go check that out, that's beyond the scope of these videos, But there is this module called cbox-ioc available on GitHub that you can use to sort of bridge the gap between the coldbox wirebox way of doing things and third-party DI frameworks like DI1 or ColdSpring. And of course, more information is available on how to do that here on the GitHub page for that project.